So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Steiner's attack. Except this time we're not attacking anyone. Instead, in order to celebrate the ongoing battering of my shoulder, I can finally play again. Es ist nicht wunderbar. I am doing this Spezial-Episode. Jawohl, I am doing the special episode on how to create an army. And what kind of thoughts and considerations you should take into account when you are building and designing your army. So, and to that effect, I've prepared some, and I will go through them and explain the logic, and hopefully help you in becoming a better commander. So, first of all, there are some base facts we need to understand, right? Some basic things that never change. So let's go through the tiers. Tier 0, very important before you even start to build an army. Have a plan. Okay, you need to know what you're going to do in certain situations. You need to know how you are going to react or respond to certain things. You need to have, there needs to be some kind of coherent red line going through your deck. You know, your units need to work together very well. Your units need to synergize. It's a magic management word. So, yeah, have a plan. Now let's go through the actual tiers. Tier 1 is pretty much the most important tier. Why? Because it's the tier that will give you the early game advantage. It's the tier that really lets you get an advantage over your opponent, and even if it's a small advantage, you can then expand the advantage. But tier 1 is what helps you get the advantage, and it should be half of your deck. So it needs to be strong. And what's important, tier 1 need also to have some kind of counter against light vehicles, right? In case the enemy has a Kübelwagen or Hanomag or some shit like this, your tier 1 needs to know how to deal with it. And even if you don't have a super counter, even if you don't have a hard counter, at least, at the very, very least, have a soft counter, a unit that can maybe not destroy it, but at least stand up to it for long enough for the next tier to arrive. Talking about the next tier, tier 2. Tier 2 is, I like to call it tier 1 advanced, because you are still using mostly tier 1 units, and tier 2 is really where the actual battle begins. Your pop cap increases drastically. You go from 5 units to 10 units, and maybe 15 even, not 10 I think. But it's a very, very big increase. On a map with more than one control point, it's very, very difficult to establish any kind of reliable land control with only 5 infantry or 3 infantry and 1 vehicle. Very, very difficult. So tier 2 is where the battle actually really starts to happen, and you can actually start drawing real front lines. Now tier 2 needs to have a counter, an individual counter to both infantry and vehicle. Why? Because the enemy will also have tier 2, and the enemy may have infantry or may have vehicles in his tier 2, and you need to have a counter to that. You need to have a response. You need to be able to deal. And then finally you get to tier 3. Tier 3 is the end game. Okay, tier 3 is what is supposed to win you the game. If tier 3 doesn't win you the game, then you're doing something wrong. Okay? So, and that you design it according to your strategy, according to your battle plan. That goes back to tier 0, the preparations have a plan. So, and now that we talk a little bit about the theory, let's look at a couple of decks in practice. Let's look at a couple of concrete decks. So the game has support for 3 decks at the same time. So I prepared 3 decks here. And this is what I would call a super unit deck. Because getting to the mouse is the ultimate end result, is the goal. The goal, the battle plan, the overarching strategy of the game, of this deck, is to rush through and get the mouse. And then just drive the mouse to the base and win the game. Right? So to that effect, it's a very strong tier 1. To really get map control and get the effect. It's the tier 2 with Panzerjäger and Wespe is really just it's on the expensive side, and it's specifically chosen this unit because they do a lot of damage. They're squishy, but you have Engineer, and Engineer is super useful against squishy things, with squishy things, because the squishy things heal faster. So the Engineer is even more efficient with that. They are a little bit more on the expensive side. Why? Because the mouse is super expensive for Tier 3, of course, because it's a super unit. So you need a pretty good Tier 2 in order to hold off the enemy long enough. That's why the Panzerjäger and Vespa are there, because they do really a lot of damage. They are squishy, you need to work. Okay, nothing good is ever free. But yeah, so that's the goal of the deck. You have the Folk, which lets you spam a lot of units quickly and get map control. You have the Jäger and Mörser, which can, which do work. With the Kübel, you are very schnell. With the Kübel, you are very fast and you can sprint from point to point. Do the agile defense. Yeah, that's what I would call a super unit deck. Next, we have this artillery deck, which I prepared. The early game is a little bit similar. You have the Volk to get map control, Engineer, Jäger, Mörser, and then let's talk about Tier 2. Tier 2, we have the Panzerwagen and the Stug. Why the Panzerwagen? The Panzerwagen, because there is no Hanomag, no Kübel, no real anti-armor, no really serious stuff in Tier 1. There's no Flammenwerfer. So that's why the Panzerwagen is there, to just have a cheap, a little bit stronger anti-infantry. And the Stug is also the cheapest. That's simply. The Stug is very cheap and it does its job. And then finally we get the Marder and the Wespe. Now the Wespe is actually not a Wespe. The Wespe is actually a Sturmtiger. Right? But I haven't unlocked it yet. But in this deck, the Wespe is actually a Sturmtiger. So, Tier 3, you have artillery. Right? You have the Sturmtiger, which destroys infantry long range. You have the Marder, which destroys infantry long range. I again highlight the Engineer, which is super useful in healing squishy units just like this. And the Panzerwagen and the Stug, they are also chosen cheap because they are supposed to be on the front line. They are supposed to give the enemy something to shoot at, something to distract him, so that he doesn't go and kill your artillery, your Marder, and your Sturmtiger. But the artillery is supposed to do all the heavy work, and you just send infantry for visibility and vehicles to have something at the front, to hold the front. Yeah, that's the red line of this deck. That's the overarching thought of this deck. And then finally we go to number 1, which is the one I like to play personally. And you know my strategy, so I don't have to talk too much about it. The overarching red line, the overarching strategy is very similar to a super unit deck, but this is more flexible. So the Tier 1 is very expensive. That's the first thing you notice. And that's by design, because I want the Jäger to be my cheapest unit, so I start with the Jäger. And that's a significant tactical advantage to all the people that start with a Volk or NG or something. Yeah, and then I have the Hanomag, of course, who dominates the early game. This deck, Tier 1, is really very expensive, and you can't afford to lose any unit, basically. Maybe one, but if you start losing more than one unit with the Tier 1, it's going to get very, very tough. Very, very tough. Tier 2 then is really pretty much just the basics, right? Tier 2, you have an MG, which is cheap and effective against infantry. You have Panzer 3, which is cheap and isn't a good all-rounder. It does everything. It doesn't amaze and it doesn't disappoint. It does its job perfectly well, right? Tier 2 is really just like the super unit is supposed to just hold off anything that I need. Right, but in ideally, we dominate with Tier 1 and we get the equally and we just sprint all the way through to Tier 3. Right, and then Tier 3, instead of one super unit, I have 2 strong units, right? And that is a conscious decision, because number 1, maybe you're stupid and you lose your super unit and you're in the cooldown and you need something quickly, because otherwise the enemy will roll into your base. Happened to me before, the Panther saved my life. And the other reason is that the strong unit like Panther and Tiger, they're much more flexible than the super unit. The mouse cannot kill infantry, the Panzer and the Tiger can dispatch of infantry. So yeah, those are the reasons why I choose these units, and it gives you more flexibility. I can still play a standard game with this deck. I don't have to rush to the mouse and to get the mouse to win the game, which the super unit deck pretty much is relying upon. Yeah, that's pretty much it for a quick deck overview. I leave you again with this list. Remember to have a plan, have units that work well together, have an overarching strategy. Your tier 1 must be strong, because you need the eco, you always want the eco. Your tier 1 must have a counter to light vehicles. Your tier 2 has to have a counter to both types, and your tier 3 is according to your strategy. Thank you for watching, and you will see again more videos very soon.